13-year-old Kyle stood at a biker clubhouse gate with a question no one expected. My foster dad says I'll end up in jail like my real dad. Will you help me prove him wrong? Most people would have turned him away. One man didn't. What happened next changed everything. The Steel Vultures motorcycle club wasn't the kind of place where kids showed up asking for help. Located on the industrial edge of town, wedged between a salvage yard and an abandoned textile mill, the clubhouse was marked by a weather-beaten sign and a chain-link fence that had seen better decades. Most people crossed the street when they walked past. But on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, 13-year-old Kyle Bunton stood at that gate anyway. He'd been there for 20 minutes, his thin frame casting a long shadow across the cracked pavement. His sneakers were held together with duct tape, his jeans 2 inches too short, and his backpack looked like it had survived a war. He wasn't crying. He wasn't yelling. He was just standing there, fingers wrapped around the cold metal links, watching the men inside work on their motorcycles. Brad noticed him first. He was elbow-deep in an engine rebuild when he felt it, that prickle at the back of your neck when someone's been watching too long. The kid's eyes weren't angry or scared. They were calculating, like he was running through a mental checklist of all the ways this could go wrong. Brad wiped his hands on a rag and walked over. Up close, he could see the kid's jaw was clenched so tight it had to hurt. You lost. Brad's voice came out rougher than he intended. Kyle shook his head. No, sir. Then what are you doing here? The boy took a breath that seemed to cost him something. My foster dad says I'll end up in jail like my real dad. His voice cracked slightly. Will you help me prove him wrong? Brad froze. Behind him, the sounds of the garage had gone quiet. 3 other members had stopped what they were doing, all of them suddenly aware that something unusual was happening at the gate. Most kids would have led with anger or excuses. This one led with the truth. Who's your dad? Brad asked, though something in his gut already knew. Chester Bunton. He's at Riverbend State. Kyle's eyes didn't drop. He made a mistake 7 years ago. Drove the getaway car for a robbery he didn't even know was happening. His so-called friend used him. But everyone just remembers the conviction. Brad's hand tightened on the fence. He remembered Chester. Quiet guy, kept to himself, spent his time in the prison library studying law books, trying to understand where everything went wrong. He'd talked about his son once, how the kid was smart, how he hoped Kyle wouldn't remember him this way. What makes you think we can help? Brad kept his tone neutral, testing. Because you know what it's like. Kyle's voice steadied. My foster dad showed me articles about this club. Said you're all criminals, that I'd end up exactly like you if I kept acting out. But I looked you up too, Mr. Harrison. You did 18 months for assault. Got out 6 years ago. Haven't been back since. He paused. You know how hard it is to stop being what everyone expects. The other club members exchanged glances. The kid had done his homework. Brad studied Kyle for a long moment. The boy's hands were shaking slightly, but his gaze never wavered. This wasn't manipulation. It was desperation mixed with something rarer. Genuine determination. You know how to use tools? Brad finally asked. I can learn. That's not what I asked. Kyle hesitated, then admitted, basic stuff. Screwdrivers, wrenches. YouTube taught me how to fix my foster mom's toaster last month. Brad turned and walked toward the garage. Kyle's face fell. He thought he was being dismissed. But then Brad came back carrying something. A push mower that looked like it had been through hell, grass still caked on the blades, one wheel bent at an odd angle. This thing's been broken for 3 months, Brad said, pushing it through a gap in the fence. Nobody here wants to deal with it. You fix it, you bring it back, and we'll talk. Kyle stared at the mower, then at Brad. That's it? Just fix it. No instructions. No help. Just you, whatever tools you can find, and time. Brad's expression was unreadable. You want to prove you're not destined for a cell? Start by proving you can finish something nobody else wanted to touch. Kyle grabbed the mower's handlebar. It was heavier than he expected, and the bent wheel made it pull hard to the left. When do you need it back? Whenever you're done. Could be tomorrow. Could be never. Brad turned to walk away, then stopped. And kid? I knew your dad. He wasn't a bad man. He was a good man who trusted the wrong person on the worst possible day. Don't let anybody tell you that's the same as being evil. Something shifted in Kyle's expression. His shoulders dropped half an inch, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he blinked. He wrestled the mower down the sidewalk as the sun began to set behind the industrial skyline. Inside the clubhouse, 3 men watched him disappear around the corner. "You think he'll actually do it?" one of them asked. Brad didn't answer right away. He just picked up his wrench and returned to his engine. "We'll see if he comes back." Kyle returned on Thursday afternoon, 2 days after he'd taken the mower. This time he didn't hesitate at the gate. He walked straight through the open entrance, pushing the lawnmower ahead of him. The engine hummed smoothly, the bent wheel had been straightened, and the blade housing gleamed where he'd scrubbed away years of caked grass and rust. Brad was under a Harley when he heard the familiar rattle of the mower. He rolled out from beneath the bike, oil streaking his forearms, and found Kyle standing in the middle of the garage bay. The kid looked like he hadn't slept. A fresh cut crossed his knuckles, and grease had worked its way so deep under his nails it might never come out. "It runs," Kyle said simply. Brad stood, wiping his hands. "Show me." Kyle pulled the starter cord. The engine caught on the first try, settling into a steady rhythm that filled the garage. He let it run for 30 seconds, then shut it down. That's when he reached into his backpack and pulled out a folded stack of notebook pages. "The carburetor was gummed up with old fuel," Kyle explained, handing the papers to Brad. "Had to take it apart, clean every jet with a wire brush and carb cleaner I borrowed from AutoZone. They let me return it after." He pointed to his notes. The bent wheel wasn't just cosmetic, it was throwing off the whole balance, making the blade shake. "Found a replacement at the junkyard for $3. The air filter was basically dirt, so I made a temporary one from an old t-shirt until you can get a real one." Brad flipped through the pages. They were detailed diagrams showing how Kyle had disassembled the carburetor, notes on which screws went where, observations about what had caused each problem. The handwriting was cramped but legible, with arrows and labels marking every component. "Where'd you learn to document like this?" Brad asked. "Science class. Teacher says if you can't explain your process, you didn't really learn anything." Kyle shifted his weight. "Also, I figured if I screwed up, at least you'd know what I tried." One of the other club members, a man called Reaper with a gray beard down to his chest, walked over and examined the mower. He crouched down, checked the wheel alignment, peered at the blade. "Kid actually fixed it," he said, surprise evident in his voice. Brad folded the notes and handed them back. "Keep those. You'll need them for the next job." Kyle's head snapped up. "Next job. Saturday morning, 6 a.m. You're riding with me to a plumbing call in Riverside." Brad pulled a business card from his wallet and handed it over. Brad's Home Repairs was printed in simple block letters with a phone number. "I take side jobs on weekends. You want to learn, you show up on time, you work hard, and you don't complain. Deal?" Kyle stared at the card like it was made of gold. "Deal." That Saturday, Kyle was waiting outside Brad's apartment at 5:45, clutching a thermos of instant coffee he'd made himself. Brad pulled up in a battered Ford pickup with a toolbox rattling in the bed, and they drove across town as the sun turned the sky orange. The job was a burst pipe under a kitchen sink at a rental property. The tenant, a tired-looking woman with 2 kids hanging on her legs, had been using buckets for 3 days because the landlord was too busy to send anyone. Brad lay on his back under the sink while Kyle handed him tools. "3/4 wrench," Brad would say, and Kyle would dig through the toolbox until he found it. Sometimes he got it wrong, grabbed a socket instead of an open-end wrench, but Brad would just correct him and move on. "Why'd the pipe burst?" Kyle asked while Brad worked. "Over-tightened connection. Someone didn't know when to stop cranking." Brad grunted as he loosened a fitting. Plumbing isn't about force. It's about knowing exactly how much pressure something can take before it breaks. Kyle absorbed that, writing it down in a small notebook he'd started carrying everywhere. 2 hours later, the pipe was replaced and tested. The woman tried to tip Brad an extra 20, but he waved it off. "Kid did half the work. Give it to him. Kyle stared at the crumpled bill in his hand like he'd never seen money before. I can't. You earned it, Brad said. Get used to that feeling. They did 3 more jobs that day. Kyle learned that AC units lie about their problems, garbage disposals jam on things you'd never expect, and gates only look simple until you try to hang one level. By the time Brad dropped Kyle back at his foster home that evening, the kid's clothes were filthy, his arms ached, and his notebook was filled with new observations. Same time next Saturday, Brad said as Kyle climbed out of the truck. I'll be ready. Brad watched the kid walk toward a house with peeling paint and a dead lawn. Through the window, he could see a man sitting in a recliner, beer in hand, not even looking up as Kyle came through the door. Over the next 6 weeks, it became routine. Every Saturday, Kyle would meet Brad before dawn. They'd work job sites across 3 counties, crawl spaces, attics, basements, garages. Brad taught him how to diagnose problems, how to talk to customers without sounding like he was guessing, how to clean up a work site so it looked better than when they arrived. The club started noticing the change too. Kyle would stop by the clubhouse after school sometimes, asking questions about the bikes, offering to sweep up or organize tools. The members tested him with small repairs: a wobbly bar stool, a stuck window, a loose outlet cover. He handled each one seriously, returning with the job done right. Reaper, watching Kyle rewire a lamp one afternoon, leaned toward Brad. Kids got something. Brad nodded, not taking his eyes off Kyle's careful work. Yeah, he's got something nobody gave him credit for. What's that? Follow through. 3 months into the mentorship, Brad brought paperwork to the clubhouse that changed everything. Kyle was tightening the chain on one of the members' bikes when Brad dropped a thick envelope on the workbench beside him. Youth Trade Certification Program, Brad said. Applications are due next week. You're applying. Kyle wiped his hands and pulled out the forms. His eyes scanned the requirements. The usual bureaucratic maze. Signatures, proof, recommendations. His stomach dropped. My foster dad won't sign this. He told me last week that trade school is for people too stupid for real college. He doesn't need to sign it. Brad tapped a section Kyle had missed. Legal guardian or approved mentor. I already talked to the program director. She's willing to accept me as your vocational sponsor if you can maintain AB average in your regular classes. Kyle looked up sharply. Why would you do that? Because 3 months ago you fixed a mower nobody else wanted to touch. Now you can diagnose an HVAC problem faster than guys who've been doing this for years. Brad crossed his arms. Talent like that doesn't need permission. It needs direction. The application required an essay about career goals. Kyle spent 4 nights working on it at the clubhouse because his foster home didn't have decent internet. Reaper, who'd run a design firm before a divorce and a motorcycle became his whole life, read over Kyle's shoulder one evening. You write like you're apologizing for existing, Reaper observed. Stop that. Write like someone who knows what he's worth. Kyle rewrote it. This time he didn't hedge. He explained how his father's mistake had taught him that one bad decision could erase years of good ones, and how he wanted to build a life where his work spoke louder than anyone's assumptions. He described learning to see problems as puzzles rather than obstacles, and how the Steel Vultures had shown him that respect isn't given based on your last name. It's earned through consistency. He got accepted 2 weeks later. The program met Tuesday and Thursday evenings at the community college. Kyle would finish his regular school day, catch a bus across town, and spend 3 hours learning electrical theory, blueprint reading, and safety protocols alongside kids who were 2 and 3 years older. He was usually the youngest person in the room, but his hand went up the most. Brad started teaching him the business side too. How to write an estimate that was fair but profitable. How to spot a client who'd pay on time versus one who'd find reasons to complain. How to explain a repair in terms a customer could understand without talking down to them. People don't just pay for the fix, Brad explained during a drive to a water heater replacement. They pay for confidence. They need to believe you know what you're doing and that you're not going to rip them off. Master those 2 things, and you'll never be short on work. One Saturday, Brad handed Kyle a measuring tape and a notepad. Price this job for me. Tell me what it'll cost and how long it'll take. It was a deck repair, 3 rotted boards, a wobbly railing, and a gate that hung crooked. Kyle walked the perimeter twice, making notes, checking measurements against material prices he'd memorized from hardware store trips. 20 minutes later, he handed Brad a written estimate. Brad read it, then showed Kyle the quote he'd already prepared. They were close enough that Brad just whistled low. "You're ready for your own jobs," Brad said. That's when Reaper stepped in with something Kyle hadn't expected. A logo. He designed it on his ancient laptop. A simple wrench crossed with a hammer, surrounded by text that read Kyle's Repairs in bold, clean letters. Underneath, no excuses, just work. Kyle stared at the screen. "You made this for me?" "Made it for the club," Reaper corrected with a half smile. "You're representing us now. Better look professional." The club took up a collection. Nobody contributed more than $20, but it added up. They ordered business cards by the box, printed on heavy cardstock that felt substantial in Kyle's hands. When the box arrived, Kyle sat at the clubhouse table and just stared. Brad had to clear his throat twice before the kid even moved. His 14th birthday fell on a Tuesday. Brad told him they had a pickup truck repair job that morning, so Kyle showed up at the garage expecting another lesson. Instead, the entire club was there, standing around a red Craftsman rolling toolbox that looked like it had just come off the showroom floor. "Every real tradesman needs real tools," Brad said. "This is yours. You fill it with what you earn." Kyle ran his hand across the smooth metal surface. His voice came out rough. "I can't afford this. It's not a gift. It's an investment." Brad's expression was serious. "We're betting on you, Kyle. Don't make us regret it." Kyle nodded because he didn't trust his voice. His first paying customer came that same week. The middle school where Kyle had spent 7th grade needed their staff room sink fixed. Constant leak. Previous plumber had made it worse. Kyle took the job solo, Brad waiting in the truck outside in case things went sideways. He worked carefully, methodically, testing each connection twice. The leak stopped. The drain ran clear. He cleaned up every drop of water, left the cabinet under the sink better organized than he'd found it. Mr. Landon, the science teacher who'd once told Kyle he had potential if he'd just apply himself, watched from the doorway. He noticed the patch on Kyle's sleeve, the Steel Vultures logo that Brad had given him permission to wear. "Where'd you learn all this?" Landon asked. Kyle looked up from packing his tools, meeting the teacher's eyes with something that hadn't been there a year ago. Certainty. "I earned it." Landon read the business card Kyle handed him. His eyebrows went up. He read it again, slower this time, then looked at Kyle differently than he ever had in a classroom. That night, Kyle logged his first payment in a notebook Brad had given him for tracking jobs. More money than he'd ever earned in his life. He stared at the number until the ink seemed to glow. The phone number on his business cards started ringing. Word traveled in a town that size. A single mother whose disposal quit working. An elderly man whose front steps were coming loose. Each job, Kyle showed up on time, worked clean, and charged fair prices. By the end of the month, he'd completed 8 jobs. His toolbox was filling up, one quality tool at a time, each one purchased with money he'd earned by proving that where you come from doesn't dictate where you're going. 6 months after Kyle's first solo job, his reputation had grown beyond what anyone expected. His phone rang during classes. He'd learned to silence it, returning calls during lunch with the professionalism of someone twice his age. The notebook where he tracked jobs had been replaced by a simple spreadsheet Brad taught him to maintain. Almost 24 repairs, each one logged and dated. A 5-star average on the community page where clients left reviews. One review stood out. Judge Catherine Moranis had hired Kyle to fix a persistent problem with her home office radiator that 3 other contractors couldn't solve. Kyle traced it to a pressure valve issue nobody had thought to check. In her review, she wrote, "Professional, thorough, and honest. This young man has a bright future." Brad showed Kyle the review on his phone one Saturday morning. "You know what this means?" Kyle shook his head. "Means you're not some kid playing handyman anymore. You're legitimate. Brad paused. Also means the billboard company called. They want to feature local success stories. Judge Moranis' review is going up on Route 9 next week. Kyle's hands went still on the wrench he'd been holding. A billboard? That costs money we don't have. Already paid for. Anonymous donor. Brad's expression made it clear the club had pooled together for this too, but he wasn't going to make Kyle feel indebted. Sometimes good work deserves to be seen. The billboard went up on a Thursday. Kyle didn't see it himself until Brad drove him past it after a job. There it was, 20 feet high, Kyle's logo, Judge Moranis' 5-star review in bold letters, and a phone number people could actually call. Kyle stared at it until Brad had to honk at him to get back in the truck. What Kyle didn't know was who else had seen it. His foster father, Greg, drove Route 9 every day to his warehouse job. He'd spent over a year telling Kyle he was wasting his time, that trade work was for people too dumb to do anything else, that the apple never falls far from the tree. Thursday afternoon, Greg sat in traffic and watched dozens of cars pass beneath a billboard praising the kid he'd written off. He didn't say anything that night when Kyle came home late from a repair job. Didn't say anything Friday either. But Saturday morning, when Kyle was packing his toolbox to meet Brad, Greg appeared in the doorway. That billboard on Route 9, Greg said. His voice was different, not softer, but missing the edge it usually carried. That you? Yes, sir. Greg looked at the toolbox, organized, professional. Business cards in a case. Work boots that actually got cleaned after jobs. Judge left that review? She did. A long silence stretched between them. Greg seemed to be calculating something, some internal equation that wasn't adding up the way he'd expected. Finally, he just nodded and walked away. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even acknowledgement. But it was the first time he hadn't torn Kyle down in 6 months. Kyle shouldered his toolbox and headed out the door. At the clubhouse that afternoon, something else was waiting. A kid, maybe 12, stood at the gate with the same posture Kyle had worn a year ago, uncertain but determined. Brad was already walking toward him when Kyle pulled up on the bicycle he'd bought with repair money. "Can I help you?" Brad asked the new kid. The boy's voice cracked. "My mom says I need to learn something useful. Says sitting around playing video games isn't going to pay rent when I'm older. I heard about Kyle. Someone at school said he works here sometimes." Kyle walked over, still holding his toolbox. The kid looked at him with something close to awe. "You really started when you were 13? The kid asked. 13 and desperate," Kyle said honestly. "What's your name?" "Chester." Kyle and Brad exchanged a glance. The same name as Kyle's father. The coincidence felt deliberate, like the universe was testing whether Kyle understood what he'd been given. "You know how to use tools?" Kyle asked, echoing the question Brad had asked him. "I can learn." "That's not what I asked." Kyle couldn't help the small smile. He walked to Brad's workbench and grabbed a socket set that needed reorganizing. Sockets mixed up, missing pieces, the case grimy with old grease. "Clean this up. Put everything in order. Figure out what's missing and make a list. Bring it back when you're done." The kid, Chester, took the case carefully, like it was a test he couldn't afford to fail. "What if I mess up?" he asked. "Then you'll learn what doesn't work," Kyle said. "That's half of learning anything." Chester nodded and left with the socket set tucked under his arm. Brad watched him go, then turned to Kyle. "You sound like me. Learned from the best." Kyle set his toolbox down and pulled out his phone, checking his schedule. "Got a water heater consult at 3, then a door frame repair at 5. After that, I need to study for my algebra test." "Still planning on law school?" Brad asked. "Every day." Kyle's voice was firm. "My dad needed a better lawyer. Probably 1,000 other people do too. But this," he gestured to his toolbox, to the clubhouse, to everything the past year had built, "this pays for that dream. And it reminds me that I'm not afraid of hard work." Reaper walked over with a coffee, having overheard. "You know, when you first showed up, I gave you 2 weeks before you quit. What changed your mind?" "You came back." Reaper shrugged. "Most people don't." That evening, after his last job, Kyle rode past Route 9 again. The billboard glowed under the streetlights, and he allowed himself a moment to stop and look at it. Evidence. That's what it was. Proof that shame didn't have to be permanent. That one person believing in you could redirect everything. That the cycle could break if you were willing to work for it. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Saw your billboard. Need someone to fix my garage door. Available Tuesday. Kyle saved the contact and replied, Tuesday at 4 p.m. works. Address? Another job. Another chance to prove that where you start doesn't determine where you finish. He pedaled home as the sun set, his empty toolbox rattling against the bike frame. Tomorrow he'd fill it again. The day after that, too. That's how futures got built. Kyle didn't just prove his foster dad wrong. He proved something bigger. That shame isn't destiny, and one person willing to believe in you can change everything. What would you have done in Brad's place? Share your thoughts below. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to embrace the journey for more stories that remind us why second chances matter. See you in our next video.